Okay, hi everyone. So I wanted to give you just a little bit of short background on literary journalism, the genre in itself as part of creative nonfiction, and some of the stories that we're going to read. I didn't want to justify us sort of spending all this money on a textbook because the majority of the information about literary journalism actually comes from an extension of its place in creative nonfiction, and also by reading a good amount of what you see is going to come from reading the stories. So, literary journalism sometimes is called narrative journalism, and the two names are used pretty interchangeably. It's creative nonfiction that contains accurate, well researched information. That's key here. Its biggest asset is its research. It's related to immersion journalism, and that's where a writer follows a subject or a theme for a long period of time, so typically weeks or months, and it details that person's experiences from a deeply personal perspective. I know we only have 7 weeks in class, so we're going to be focusing on, a couple shorter pieces, but know that some of that can take much longer. It's another essay form. It's typically one that you want to immerse yourself in at the intermediate and advanced level. I have had students so very interested in literary journalism from what they've learned in creative nonfiction that I'm so excited to be offering this class in the hopes that you might want to go more in depth into the topic one day as well. It is the form that probably comes closest to newspaper and magazine writing. It's extremely fact driven. It requires research, often interviews. And though sometimes memoir and personal essays are enhanced by research, literary journalism depends on it. And we'll talk about integrating that research into your writing. It is sometimes called immersion journalism because it really requires this closer, very active relationship that the subject and the people have, and that's what the journalist is exploring. Like journalistic writing, it should be very well researched. It should focus on a brief period of time. So, whereas like a memoir focuses on the majority or a big portion of someone's life, this is just focusing on a certain time that you would pick or the subject might pick. And it might concentrate on what's happening outside of the writer's small circle of personal experience and feelings. Um, we're going to go back and do more of the history of literary journalism, but it would be remiss of us not to mention author Tom Wolfe, and his 1973 collection titled The New Journalism gives us the current definition as well as kind of perspective on literary journalism. So back in the 60s and 70s, this was the style of journalism that used these different literary techniques that were really kind of unconventional for the time. If you think about the 60s and 70s, most of the journalism that's happening has come off of what's from like war reporting or very hardcore just fact reporting. Literary journalism combines story and fact. The creative part of literary journalism, the literary part comes in the way that you tell the story, right? Traditional journalism is just there to give you the information, not give you any personal perspective or not give you any story behind the story. And even though new journalism still gives you factual events in an objective manner, it uses character development, voice, point of view. That's the creative parts that come in to communicate these events in narrative. Narrative meaning your story. And as a style, new journalism was frequently published in magazines, not newspapers. So that's why a lot of these pieces are coming from magazines that we have. Even though new journalism was coined by Tom Wolfe, it doesn't really have a concrete origin. It can be traced back, at least here, to the early 60s. You had other authors such as Norman Mailer, Gay Talese, and a lot of them influenced the emergence of this new journalism, and we're going to look at some of these pieces. So some early magazines like Esquire and New York Magazine adopted this style, and of course they're still around today. Despite being dubbed kind of the new journalism in the 60s, it can absolutely go back as old as some of these classic texts like the Iliad or the Bible. It's as accurate as traditional, journalism and as readable as good fiction. Point of view is sometimes handled very differently in literary journalism than other forms of creative nonfiction. So literary journalists really are looking to engage in their subject in whatever ways possible. Wolfe's new journalism captured the reader's attention. It's definitely a different way of looking and writing. It has vivid, intense prose. It has a writing style that broke all the rules of form and style and content. It didn't adhere to like strict word counts or like a pyramid style of reporting. So you would have new journalists that could write stories as long as 40,000 words or as short as 3,000 words, just a couple pages. And Woolf was not only very serious about his intention to create a new style of writing, but he had a lot of literary ambitions with this. He really saw himself as a creator of this form of writing that could kind of go up against a novel, and he really took pride in that. So writers in general depend on advanced reporting. We use history and legal documents, public records, diaries, personal accounts, correspondence, letters, databases, websites, and so much more to be adding to stories. And so to have and to be an effective literary journalist, you have to give readers that chance to gain enlightened perspective, right? You're giving them something extraordinary in everyday life and more rich understanding than they would get from a traditional story. Big questions and parts that come into the genre. We talk a lot about journalistic credibility, like, hey, you're still writing a journalism piece, so you have to be pretty factual. You have to talk about ethics in literary journalism, which we will in week 2. Everything has to be verifiable in some capacity. It's all about the use of information, not imagination, especially for journalism. And it's using your creative presentation of facts. You're not necessarily, creating facts, right? You're not creating something that didn't exist. You're looking to create a really unique way of telling the story, telling the events, and things of that sort. So that certainly is that can be different, and that can be really hard at first. So I completely agree that it takes a lot of time. There's a lot of techniques we're going to work our way through. So basically with these techniques, we're going to take probably two of these techniques every week, and we're going to sort of break them down and do some writing exercises that help us with these, writing exercises that help us combine these techniques, which are not uncommon to either fiction and or nonfiction writing, but they are all really, really important. So things like developing scenes, your characters, looking a lot for psychological depth, being really descriptive with sensory and status details, using dialogue is really important, point of view, metaphors and similes, and literary style. So when writing your own literary journalism, you want to limit your subject, right? If you try to fit everything into one essay, it's just not going to work, right? So maybe your essay ends up being a 3-parter. That's okay. But you have to have a limit. There's really no subject not suitable for literary journalism because almost any aspect of our world is interesting if you take the time to study and write it. And it's so important to do your research. This means reading your topic beforehand. This means thinking of questions, taking notes. You almost have to put that journalist hat on there. Your observations in your writing may end up being flattering, or they could be critical, supportive, dismissive. You have to have your focus narrow enough to a certain time period. There is also no problem using I in your essay, but you want to use it sparingly. So you don't want your use of I to interfere with any observations or any reactions to what you're writing about. And that will come in with looking at the ethics of kind of what we're doing and looking at the ethics of literary journalism. So I'm going to go back over here. I want to switch this up and show you. I wanted to just focus on week 1 right now. And in terms of looking at week 1, so you can see everything up here, please make sure to listen and watch these notes. You can go back and read them. I've uploaded the PowerPoints for this week. Every week we'll have writing exercises. We'll be working on formal papers, which we've got about 3 to 4 formal papers, so that'll take us, sometimes 1.5 to 2 weeks each. These also have peer review. These have separate directions with them, so please read them. I have much more information and notes on the history of the genre, which I hope you'll enjoy. We have a welcome discussion for this week, and of course we have a response to our reading for this week. This week our reading is Where Worlds Collide by Pico Iyer. It's a really cool, you can click this right here and this PDF will bring you to the reading, which is a very interesting reading about place. It's also taking something very ordinary like an airport and putting some extraordinary details around it. So I do hope you enjoy that. You just click on the X to respond and follow the directions for this week. Our class, like I said, is only 7 weeks or 7.5 weeks if you add in the 3 extra days. So please do make sure that you're following along. It is a lot of work because it's an intensive 7 weeks, but my hope is that you get so many great pieces of writing out of this class, so much good feedback and love and appreciation for a new genre.